Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about X-Men Season 1. I'm sort of going to do these reviews where I review each season of the X-Men show from the 90s, and go through them. I have previously reviewed Night of the Sentinels and Pride of the X-Men. You can watch those videos. If you want to, there'll be cards, and they'll be in the end screen, and in the description, all those things. But X-Men was a big show for me. I was already reading comics. I was already reading X-Men comics. I had the Jim Lee cards. I had some action figures. I'd seen Pride of the X-Men. I'm not entirely sure how much I'd read since this is sort of a little bit ago. And I was in elementary school, but I was really into Marvel comics, like the comics, not the everything else that we've seen since. And I was really into the X-Men. And so this show coming out was an immensely huge deal for me. I remember specifically when Night of the Sentinels came out, my dad came with the ingenious idea to record each of these, so I actually have the air cuts of each of the episodes, which get into the animation quality later. So I watched this season so many times as a whole thing throughout my childhood that I don't think there's a piece of X-Men media or even a season of television or even certain movies. Like, this is probably one of the things I've watched the most, maybe ever. Specifically Night of the Sentinels, that one too, but all of it so many times. Just constantly watching it, constantly obsessed with it. And it's an amazingly solid season of television. Probably the first piece of media to really do comic book continuity. Had to be in a certain order. You had to watch it in that order, which I really liked about it. It reminded me of like reading X-Men classics at the time and going back and reading all the Claremont stuff, and which was then like just ending, and then reading the newer stuff and knowing you needed to have all these certain things together. How it all worked, it just felt, especially the writing, felt very different. It felt like a comic book media thing that got comic books. It wasn't like a comic book character had been adapted into a thing or something. This very much felt like X-Men, and through the writing with people like Eric Lewald and great direction by Larry Houston, they really captured the idea of the X-Men. Now this season, I think certain seasons of this show, the next two, you kind of know what the focus is and what they're building to and all these things, but in this season it seems to really be setting up, and I think it's really smart when superhero stuff doesn't set up like the big villain first, because the big villain sort of needs their own thing, and sort of combining them in the same movie has mixed results. Like the Sam Raimi Spider-Man, absolutely, that works great. Tim Burton's Batman, which you could say Nicholson sort of steals the show, but it's a hard balance. And I like that in this, although Magneto comes into this, he's not necessarily the focus. The focus is the Sentinels. The Sentinels highlight a larger purpose to show that the mutants are sort of hated and discriminated against, and that the government is paying an outside weapons manufacturer to make, or just to Trask and Gyrick, and like, I don't know if they have a business. It's just those two in the cartoon, but basically, I know we are aware they're an outside thing, but to make these Sentinels to attack these mutants and control the mutant control agency and all stuff like that. And that I think really works because you understand people hate them, you understand the government will literally fund something that will hurt them, and the Sentinels are giant robots, and giant robots are cool to watch people with superpowers rip up and push and shoot laser beams at and stuff. So it works on a lot of levels there, but I do think having that central idea in X-Men, you have a lot of stuff explained while you have a lot of cool action going on together. And particularly, I think Night of the Sentinels works because that opening scene in the mall, one of my favorite mall action sequences of all time, right up there with stuff from Night of the Comet and Terminator 2. I don't know if there's an action sequence in the mall Night of the Comet, but cool stuff does happen in a mall in that movie, so I'm going to count it. But it does remind me a bit of Terminator 2, which was, they referenced a few times, but and was very relevant then. And it has so many iconic things, from like, Gambit hanging out in the playing card shop. The 90s malls were crazy, so I think I bought it at the time. To where Jubilee is with Storm and Rogue, like shopping and like all the Sentinel stuff, and it works in tandem, and you get to see the X-Men sort of fight together. And this show doesn't have a ton of as much of the X-Men fighting together as a team, which was always like something they did in, especially the 80s comics and stuff like that, like the Fastball Special and stuff like that. With Wolverine and Colossus, you had these collaborative fights. They don't do that a ton, but I will say, when they do it, man, does the show pop. And it is like, I was like, I love that kind of stuff. That is like, I don't really like, was like, I think the Night of the Sentinels, the opening works really well with that, but then when they're all fighting together at the end of the Night of the Sentinels two-parter, and even at the end where you get to the last episode of the season, the final decision, which I think really, that's an episode that, not so much from the comics to my understanding, but more so that wraps up kind of the whole idea that starts with it. I do feel like it's sort of the only real sequel to Night of the Sentinels in a lot of ways, and I do think it sort of works with the whole idea of like the Sentinels will get out of control, the X-Men need to sort of do something about it. Apparently the crew was told they were only hired for one season, so it does sort of work as just like this complete thought, even though they have that little Mr. Sinister thing, but which I don't think they use the same voice overall. One thing I really do like about the show as well is how it did build with each episode, much like a comic. One episode I actually really thought, because I think there's a lot of these one-offs, and you have the villain of the week, like the Unstoppable Juggernaut, or like Wolverine going in that Alaska and stuff. I do feel like Deadly Reunions is an episode that, not my favorite necessarily. I do think it's sort of like reading a couple issues of a comic where just the same villain shows up, and it doesn't say like, a weird like subtitle part 1, part 2 thing. It's just like 2 issues, and I feel like Deadly Reunions and Enter Magneto do that fairly well as I feel like The Cure and Come the Apocalypse, which are both Apocalypse episodes, sort of lead into one another, but they're not treated as two-parters, they're not labeled as two-parters. They're just 2 adventures next to each other. And that's pretty crazy for a kid show at this time. Even though you did have things like Batman in the Animated Series, it really, really, I think, took advantage of that in a cool way, because it did feel like each episode was building, but it felt like comics. Like you wanted to feel the whole story, and even if you didn't see a part 1 or part 2, you understood like episode 3 and 4. I have to watch all of those. One of my favorite arcs episodes in this, other than Night of the Sentinels, I think is one, Enter Magneto, because I have a lot of good memories of that, particularly because I had waited so long for the real show to get going. I kept reading different dates about when Night of the Sentinels would come out, and then I guessed the wrong Saturday, and when it didn't come on, I believe I had quite the tantrum. I was about 8. Apparently I've learned recently that the animation studio ACOM messed up, and they had to like reorganize when they were going to air them, and so they could only air episodes 1 and 2, which weren't, the animation was kind of not great in that. And in fact, since I have the error versions, I rewatched those, and it doesn't look great. The ones on Disney Plus are better, so if you wanted to watch the thing you have but shittier, and the thing they stopped airing after a certain point, even though these were popular and they aired Night of the Sentinels a ton of times before. So I guess that tantrum was totally warranted, and my parents should clearly, sure they don't remember it, clearly exonerate me from any punishment I had at that time. But it was interesting to know. It's like, oh, okay, I wasn't crazy. That had always been like, I swear I read it somewhere, and I swear other kids told me different dates, and it was like so confusing. And it's always like, maybe we were just wrong. And I'm like, oh, apparently we were not all wrong. We just were confused on what to do, and I'm sure we got 3 different dates. But when we eventually got the full season and Enter Magneto came out in 1993, I remember there's this whole thing about that, and I noticed I'm pronouncing it Magneto. I remember going to the comic book store, and people, there was like, this is hard to describe now because people didn't believe me when I told them, but I actually sort of confirmed this literally, is that no one knew how to pronounce Magneto. People would be like, well, maybe it's Magneto. It's either Magneto or Magneto. That seemed to be like this big comic book store debate. I remember people in the comic book store, literally, I think episode aired later, and somehow we got to the comic book store for, some of this might not be right, but I do remember going to the comic book store and the guy behind the desk saying like, we'll finally find out the pronunciation. And apparently I learned from, because I got this book, which I've read some of and will be reading through more of right here. And when I went to MomoCon with Pizza Party all that time ago, Eric Lewald and I believe his wife Julia had a booth near Pizza Party, and I got to talk to them for a little. They were nice. I don't think we talked that long, but and he signed this also. They were very nice. But I actually kept telling people in Pizza Party, it was like, that was what happened. Like, no one knew how to pronounce this stuff. And they're like, are you fucking kidding me? It's magnets, isn't it Magneto? But I remember, and I talked to them, and I told them the story about how people would wait for the episode and be like, oh, that's how you pronounce some of these things. And they actually told me, no, that's true. Actually, we had to ask Stan Lee and Marvel Comics how things were pronounced. Like, they didn't know how the characters' names were pronounced. What was the universal pronunciation? And I've learned since then, I believe they might be, the people working on the show might be the first to start this tradition, is when a character is finally made into a movie or a show, or does it sort of picks the pronunciation. So a similar thing happened. I've always read, and this one I'm sketchy about, is like when I grew up it was Shang-Chi, but then when he became a movie, it became Shang-Chi. It still happens apparently, and then you get to pick the pronunciation. Now some of them are fairly, you can kind of figure it out, but it was interesting. Like, I remember that real thing about it. It was cool to talk to Eric Lewald. He was very nice to me, and he gave me more time because we had booths together than I probably should have gotten, but they were very nice people. That was a pleasant memory of mine. I also think Days of Future Past is probably the best adaptation of that story. I don't think I don't hate the Days of Future Past movie. Obviously, Kitty Pryde's not in this. Jubilee is basically the Kitty Pryde, which is fine. It's 1992, 1993. Kitty Pryde was in Excalibur, and it was like different. And like Jubilee is the Kitty Pryde of the 90s. Jubilee should be in this. They're using the Jim Lee style. Absolutely, that's fine. Would I have liked there to be an older Jubilee transported into her young body and stuff and do the Days of Future Past thing again? Sure, but instead they sent Bishop, who that comic, like I looked it up, had barely was a year old since his first appearance. And I think that's one of the things that really separates this from current comic book media, is that what changes from current comic book media is that like they were actively trying to do the comic at the time because it was selling millions of issues a month. So like having Bishop made financial sense because Bishop was a huge character at the time. Same with like Cable being in here. I think Cable and Bishop got to be in the X-Men cartoon sooner than like Miles Morales got to be in anything, or when Civil War got to be made into a movie. I was like, wow, that was pretty quick. But like looking at this was like some of these were like barely a year old and they're like in a cartoon show, which is pretty crazy, specifically at the time where sometimes it would take like decades for certain characters to get any form of non-comic media done to them. It's pretty insane to have them done fairly quickly, but I kind of like that about it. But yeah, Days of Future Past is very solid. It's only a 2-issue series, but they do, again, I think they do a good job of understanding establishing the stakes and establishing a plotline and establishing an idea. If you look at Days of Future Past, part 1 is just like all the cool stuff in the possible future, or the Sentinels take over. I mean, depressing stuff, but it does look cool. With 2 mutant teenagers who I have no clue who they are ever, but they look cool. And then Bishop goes back in time, and then he gets the X-Mansion, episode over. That's insane to me. But it establishes the whole thing, and then you get into the real meat and potatoes of Days of Future Past, which is almost exactly like those comics. Apparently Larry Houston, who's the director of a lot of these, was very much a fan, brought his own comics and stuff, and you can tell that these people, either they were fans or they really respected what they were doing, and there's a lot of respect in the writing and stuff like that. Now, as I was saying, like, this is designed like the Jim Lee X-Men comics, the design stuff like that. Those are so popular at the time. You have, even if you heard like it was the best-selling comic, all that stuff, you have no clue. Everybody had those comics. Everybody. Didn't matter. Comics were the biggest they ever were. Just comics, not the other stuff. Just comics. And so you pretty much had to use these designs because nobody's going to recognize the X-Men otherwise. The problem with that is these designs, character designs, not great. It's the animation, like I said, can be really kind of crappy at certain points. Not designed in a way for animation, is designed to be like this thing, and I sort of think that was maybe not the greatest move. And particularly at the time where in the 90s, like you had Batman the Animated Series, which was amazing animation. You had Ren and Stimpy and Auteur animation taking off, at least on television. You had so many different things. You had The Simpsons. You had so much different animation going on. And this is really good writing, really good storyboarding, I might add. But the design of the animation is not really as good as the rest of the show is, sadly. I'm kind of into it because I will say one thing Larry Houston did very well, and whoever storyboarded the show did an amazing job, because there's so many times where logic-wise, these shots should not work. I should be like, what the fuck is this? This is terrible storytelling, like visual storytelling, but they get it to work. That is like, and I'm not trying to be an asshole here or something, that's real talent, by the way, to work under your limitations, get it to work as well as this show consistently does while I was watching it. Really amazing. Like I think there's one thing, Days of Future Past, where Rogue leaves her car, flies out, flies in the X-Mansion, and is suddenly in the basement and overhearing a conversation. None of that makes any lick of sense whatsoever. But I watched it 500 times and I always buy it. There's so many sequences where like this person being here, and like I remember in one thing the blackbird's like halfway, like doesn't make sense where the blackbird landed. It's like weird, like so many odd animation choices like that. But you sort of just go with it. I mean, I was sort of pre-sold on the X-Men anyway, but there's so many times where like, you know, they'll do something, but then they'll have a really cool sequence like Wolverine fighting the Sentinels, and the light source is just their laser zaps, which by the way, no movie has done this, and like it's one of the best Wolverine sequences of all time, where he's being zapped and he's jumping, and you just see him moving by the Sentinels laser. Like, that's amazing. Like, I don't know, that last episode, they clearly made them like animate better, because that was really cool. But I do think it's well directed and the storyboard's good. The animation, the design, unfortunately not the greatest, although I still love this show. I think the new animation works a lot better, and animation has very much changed since the 90s, believe it or not. But at the time, it's like, it's a little like not the greatest, particularly at a time where animation is exploding. And this is like a huge show. You're like, I don't know. I mean, the writing really worked. I remember people of all ages watching it. I loved watching this with my dad. My dad always laughed at Beast jokes. I remember Beast is like, security, but are any of us truly secure? And my dad laughed. And I remember commenting to friends like, man, I liked watching X-Men, because like even your parents would love the Beast jokes, and they go, that's just your dad. So I was like, oh. But Beast was funny. Now that I'm a grown up, I like Beast even more. I think this is a solid piece of X-Men entertainment. I am gonna say maybe one of the most solid pieces of X-Men, maybe the most solid. I'm sort of between this and the season 3. I kind of want to rewatch. I haven't rewatched season 3. I'm doing this in order, so we'll see how I feel about that. But I really like how well this moves. I like how it brings in Genosha, which that's not even that old either. I like how it brings in Cable. I think that's just in the Genosha. Doesn't he show up later? Oh, he shows up with the Apocalypse stuff. The thing with Angel, and they attack him in his chalet, and like he zaps him through like the bookcase. Oh my god! Like some of this, like I want to knock the animation, but some of the action sequences are like truly incredibly, very well laid out. So I don't love the design and certain mistakes they do, but other times it's like, it feels like they're firing on all cylinders. So I guess shouldn't knock the animation as much as I do, but I think it just very much got what the comics were. I always thought X-Men sort of worked better as a show than a movie, even though I like movies and I like X-Men, so you'd think that would work. But I think the way X-Men is in the soap opera of it and everything, I really love this show, and I really love the first season, and warts and all. And there's a lot of these action shows that I've rewatched that I love, like Master Universe and stuff, and it's like I kind of maybe need a few drinks to get through it. To be honest, I need a little bit of something to get me there, and that is not the case with this show. I get very invested in it. I still really like the writing. I think it's the best thing that captured what X-Men really was at that time. Maybe it's because I understood X-Men more. I stopped reading at a certain point, but this is just a really solid season 1, and I'm excited to go through these seasons with you, especially the ones I remember fondly. And I don't know 4 and 5. I don't remember 4 and 5 as well as I should, so it'll be interesting to revisit some that I maybe haven't fully visited before. It'll be interesting, particularly looking back at some of the original season episodes, although I think I'm mainly go with Disney Plus. But if you've never seen this season, it's really just a great piece of X-Men. I think it transposes what X-Men truly is excellently well for television and through a new medium. It is one of my all-time favorite X-Men things, but I think because it establishes the Sentinels, it establishes X-Men, it shows so much about these characters, it feels like you fully know them, and it honestly felt shocking to see a piece of comic book media be this good. But I think it's also shocking how much respect they had for capturing the comics, not trying to be the comics through their lens. It almost felt like they had the stewardship of making the X-Men appeal to people who didn't read X-Men comics and representing the X-Men comics as they were at the time. And I don't think there's anyone who really has done it as well as this has. And even if they do episodes like The Final Decision, changing things with Apocalypse, stuff like that, it still all worked. I think it showed you working with all the limitations they have to truly make a great show. Sometimes when I watch it, I feel like it's almost a miracle it came out the way it did, but that almost makes it feel all the better that they were able to make this thing as interesting and as involving and as exactly like I wanted an X-Men show to be when I was just a little kid reading a few X-Men comics. And it's amazing to me that it still holds up to me now that I'm like 40 watching this, that it still is just solid storytelling, solid direction, and a solid cartoon for a comic that very much, I think, deserves that kind of respect. I think X-Men, the animated series, season 1 is a great piece of entertainment, and I think it shows you and sets up what the later show could fully achieve later on. So if you've seen X-Men season 1 and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.